Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a distinct honor and a privilege to moderate this session with two outstanding thought leaders. And we are here to discuss sustainability, innovation, the free trade agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the opportunities and challenges in Africa, and importantly, the importance of the Singapore-Africa trade corridor. Let me introduce briefly the speakers. Senior Minister Tharman is also the Coordinating Minister for Social Policy of Singapore. He's held many positions, including the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. He was also the Finance Minister, the Minister of Manpower, as well as the Education Minister. Besides his significant contributions to Singapore and both in and for Singapore, he's also a bit of a rock star on the international stage, particularly when it comes to development, finance, and economics. He chairs the G30. He has also chaired multiple forums for the G20, the IMF, the UN, and many other organizations. Suffice to say that when people think of Singapore in the context of economics and developmental economics and finance, the name Tharman readily comes to mind. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, agricultural economist by background, the former Agriculture Minister of Nigeria, before he became the President of African Development Bank in 2015. Not to minimize the significant contributions of his predecessors, I will say this, that Dr. Adesina has brought to African Development Bank a level of passion, energy, vigor, and urgency that is quite extraordinary. He's also the 2017 winner of the World Food Prize, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Agriculture. Besides his official role as the President of African Development Bank, his unofficial role is as the Chief African Optimist Officer. So, without further ado, let me turn to the discussion. No discussion, they say, in England starts without the discussion of the weather. In a similar vein, in 2021, no discussion starts without a discussion of the pandemic. The question is to you, Dr. Adesina. The pandemic has obviously presented unprecedented challenges for businesses and governments. The question for you is, how has Africa coped with the pandemic? And what, in your mind, are the near-term and medium-term prognosis for Africa?
Well, thank you very much, Shankar. It's good to see you. And my rock star friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, Tharman, it's nice to see you. We had your rock star performance at the African Development Bank when you visited here. It's so good to see you. And I'd like to congratulate as well the chairman of the Enterprise Singapore, Peter Ong. Thank you for your excellent opening remarks. Let me thank both of you for inviting me to this Africa-Singapore Business Forum. There's no doubt about it that we live in very, very challenging times. If you look at what has happened with the COVID-19, the impact on Africa has been, like every part of the world, quite significant. You look at the growth rates, economic growth rates, the real GDP in Africa declined by 2.1%, which is the lowest that we have had in more than 20 years. And that has brought back a lot of the gains that we have made in those 20 years in terms of faster economic growth and development on the continent. And so as the economies went into lockdowns, all kinds of things began to happen. First and foremost, the GDP of the continent went down significantly, anything between $145 billion to $190 billion. Fiscal deficits rose and doubled, actually. Debts began to accumulate. The debt to GDP ratio of Africa went from about 60% to 70%. You also found that inflation began to rise and currencies began to get depreciated because foreign reserves of countries actually went down. But that's just on the financial side. But it's the people impacts that really bothers us. It's the fact that 30 million people actually went further into poverty. We lost 30 million jobs as a result of that. And if care is not taken by the end of this year, maybe another 39 million people will fall further into poverty. However, what we've done as a bank, Shankar, it's that we very quickly responded to this. We provided a $10 billion facility to support African countries very quickly to be able to invest in the healthcare, in buying personal protective equipments, and supporting nurses and doctors and all the things they needed to do for this unplanned for exogenous shock that hit the continent. We went beyond that. We actually launched a social impact fund on the global capital markets of $3 billion. And that is, at the time that we launched it, the largest ever social impact fund in US dollar ever done in the history of the world. And so we were really pushing the end of the envelope on this. But Africa will need a lot of resources, of course, to recover. There's no doubt about that. The gross financing need that Africa will need anything about $435 billion. Now, we know that a lot of efforts have been done by us, by the World Bank, by the IMF and others to deal with many of these challenges. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but in any case, I think efforts to deal with the issue of debt and efforts also to deal with the issue of getting access to vaccines, because the real headwind here would be how we deal with the issue of debt and how we deal with the issue of vaccines. And I want to commend the African Union. They developed the African Vaccine Acquisition Platform, which is trying to deal with some of this. Right now, we have only about 2% of Africa that's actually vaccinated. So we're far behind. But I think that we are going to be able to catch up as many of these things deliver, and also as the COVAX initiative also delivers. But for the event that we're having today, which has to do with the issue of investments, there's no doubt that the foreign direct investment to Africa actually fell significantly, went down to $40 billion, which is the lowest in 15 years. If you look also for sub-Saharan Africa, it went down to $30 billion. Now, there's no doubt about it that the way in which I was listening to Peter Ong about the sentiment of investors is really what happens in terms of the greenfield investments that have been made on the continent. Greenfield investments went down, significantly on the continent, but that's all on the challenging side. Is the upside that I want to talk about. And I think Peter Ong said that a lot. Look, the fundamentals of Africa is as strong as before we went into the pandemic. It's like you go on a highway, you take a detour, you're going to go back to that same highway again and continue. The population is 1.2 billion. It's going to rise to 2 billion. If you look at the youngest population, the youth population in the world, you look at the consumer expenditure, it's going to rise to $2.1 trillion in the next 3 years. And when you also look in terms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which you know Shankar very well, and also a Deputy Prime Minister, that's $3.3 trillion combined GDP of our economies. And so there are markets that are really huge that you cannot ignore African markets. And I was very pleased listening to the chairman of Enterprise Singapore talking about the confidence that Singapore has. And I want to commend him and commend Enterprise Singapore. In the pandemic, Singapore did not stop investing in Africa. In fact, the overseas group, as part of Enterprise Singapore, signed 30 deals in 2020. This year, they've done 16. They're going to surpass that this year. That shows that Singapore trusts Africa, believes in Africa. And as you know, that is really a great thing. I'm really delighted to be here talking about that today. And just last thing I want to say about this is, what does the sentiment of investors say? For example, there was an assessment done of the investors in the special economic zones for Africa. And what he said actually is quite interesting. That 85% of the investors in special economic zones of Africa believe that for FDI will rise significantly again. And 90%, that's within Africa, and 90% say from outside Africa it's going to rise. And I'm really delighted that what we're talking about today, it's on the rebound. Look at Africa's infrastructure, look at Africa's energy, look at Africa's urban development, look at Africa's water and sanitation, and look at Africa's digitalization and rapid development, given the FCTA, and African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa is still the place to invest in, and Africa offers enormously high rate of return. I think Africa is going to bounce back. You said I'm Africa's optimist in chief. Absolutely, yes. If you're not investing in Africa, I wonder where you're investing it, quite honestly.
Thank you. Thank you. That's heartening to hear, and particularly heartening to hear the continuing interest of Singapore companies in Africa despite the pandemic. And it's and earlier, Peter Ong mentioned that this was the sixth forum of the Singapore Business Forum. I was there at the first, and I've seen virtually every edition of it. And forums like this have helped build that interest from Singapore into Africa. I want to turn to Senior Minister Tharman. Speaking at the Kofi Annan lecture hosted by the African Development Bank in 2019, you said, and I will quote you, "How the arc of history bends will depend on whether we succeed in Africa." These are pretty powerful words, pretty strong words. Could you please expand on your thinking behind this statement?
Thanks, Shankar, and very happy to be together with my good friend, Dr. Adesina, after slightly less than 2 years, when I met you in your office and you very kindly hosted me. I think Dr. Adesina has put it very powerfully, and frankly, you can feel his conviction in what he's saying. Many people around the world haven't yet recognized what the world will be like 20 years from now, when the very substantial majority of young people are going to be in Africa, when a large part of the world's agricultural supply will have to come from Africa, plus, of course, mineral supply, because Africa still has 1/3 of the world's mineral resources. But very importantly, it's the 2 points which Dr. Adesina was making. If we take both the short view and the long view, we see Africa rebounding in the short term, and we see Africa on a trajectory that is different and on a higher incline compared to most regions in the next 20 years. The rebound is fraught with risks because COVID is far from over. It is fraught with risks everywhere. And I think the leadership taken by the African Union and the key institutions, including the African Development Bank, African CDC, and others, will be instrumental. The game is not over yet, but the potential for rebound is very significant. What's critical is the medium to long term. And I think Singapore companies, Southeast Asian companies, East Asian companies, when we look at the future now, we see a world which has rich countries, mature countries with large markets, but beyond the immediate bounds we're seeing in the United States, you have to expect basically slow growth. These are rich, large, but slow growth markets. They're also markets where there are already dominant players, dominant corporate players, monopolies or otherwise. Africa is quite different. Africa's growth profile, consumption profile, and scope for investments is on a very different trajectory. And it is an environment which is not already dominated by large players, domestic or foreign. It's actually a very open environment. And that's what I found, I learned a lot about through my own visits to Africa. And I found Singapore companies, large and small, exploring Africa and striking deals. And Dr. Adesina spoke about investments last year. We, of course, have significant, long-standing players in Africa, Tolaram, Olam, and several others, with deep knowledge, deep networks, not just in the major cities, but reaching into the rural areas. But what was very encouraging was smaller Singapore companies exploring Africa, even in the midst of crisis. And of course, pre-COVID, they were already exploring Africa because it's an open field. They go there, they feel they're welcome. No environment is free of risks, but you've got to choose your partners, you've got to understand the landscape, and you don't start off very big. Get a foothold, get the right partners, start striking relationships, and start growing. And Africa is, to my mind, attractive for that second reason. It's not just the macroeconomics and not just the demographics, which is obviously in Africa's favor. It's also the fact that it's a pretty open field. And you can go there as a small business, medium-sized business, or large business. Find the right partners and grow. It is in a sense greenfield in the entrepreneurial sense. I think it also plays to the advantages of Singapore companies and others in this part of the world. Africa is at the cusp of a connectivity revolution. Frankly, Africa is far less connected than East Asia across boundaries and even between neighboring countries. The logistics is slow, it has been costly. But that's an opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to make logistics, customs clearance, digital tracking of goods far more efficient. And Singapore companies are good at that. We have a whole set of companies that are in fact getting involved one way or another in this area of removing frictions and reducing the costs of cross-border movements and even domestic logistics. Ascent Solutions, Adera, Good or GUD, Crimson Logic, several others. They're not huge companies. Some are small, some are medium-sized by international standards. They're not big at all, but they're nifty and they're entrepreneurial. And Africa is a place where entrepreneurial companies can do very well. I would just make one more point, so as not to prolong this introductory comment, which is that apart from the macroeconomics, the demographics, the infrastructure opportunities, the connectivity opportunities, Africa is, again, not recognized enough around the world for the amount of entrepreneurship that's coming up. There's a whole wave of entrepreneurship that is taking hold in Africa, mainly in the cities, but also extending into the areas outside the cities. And the digital revolution is partly responsible for this. They're growing rapidly, and it's therefore an environment very different from what one would have read in the old economics or geography books, where Africa is producing raw materials, the Europeans and others were creaming off by doing the processing and earning large margins. Africa is now becoming a producer, not just in manufacturing, where there's huge potential, particularly in agri-processing and horticulture, but also in the digital world. Africa is becoming a real player, and there's some very interesting and exciting entrepreneurial companies that are coming up in Africa. And that, to my mind, is a very large positive as well. So let me stop there, Shankar.
Thank you, Senior Minister. Very, very interesting comments. And actually, it's a good segue into the topic I wanted to explore, which is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because we tend to talk about Africa in the collective, but it's 54 or 55 countries. And some of the challenges that companies had going into Africa was the fragmentation of the market. However, that has got to change now with the Free Trade Agreement. And I know, Dr. Adesina, one of the key pillars of your high fives in African Development Bank was Integrate Africa. So this was your dream come true. Now the FTA has been signed. Now starts, if you will, the hard yards to execute and make that into tangible reality. What in your mind are the things which now need to happen? How do you see the Free Trade Agreement playing out? And what are some critical immediate milestones?
Well, thank you very much. And I want to just echo what the Deputy Prime Minister was saying about Africa being an open market. It's actually very, very true. Africa is very open to investors. And in fact, before the Deputy Prime Minister, as you know, before the pandemic hit, Africa had 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world. And also in terms of the cost of ease of doing business, you find that in terms of reforms, the doing business indices, that Africa actually accounted for 35 or 33% of the global improvements in the ease of doing business. So it's open for business. But of course, the challenge, of course, it's going to be always on infrastructure. We, over the last 10 years as a bank, have invested over $40 billion in infrastructure, mainly to support regional integration, to support things like transport, energy, in logistics, transnational highways, but also digital infrastructure. So as we look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, what are the things that we need to continue to do? First is you cannot trade if you don't have good infrastructure. And so we at a bank has been investing in a number of them. I'll talk to you about it. I mean, Shaka, you were there in Nairobi. You look at the investment we made for 1,000 kilometers linking Addis Ababa to Nairobi, all the way to the port of Mombasa. And that alone would allow trade to move between those two countries by 400%. You look at the Senegambia bridge. If you know Africa, you go to Senegal, you go to Gambia. They're so close, but there's no bridge between them. We just did that to link those two countries. If you look at the other infrastructure in ports that we are making, for example, in Southern Africa, we invested heavily in the world-based port. And that port is very critical for improving shipments within and trade, of course, in Southern Africa. But we invested in Togo, for example, deep sea port in Togo, which is now making Togo to be the transshipment point which you need for trade within the West Africa region. But obviously, tourism is a big issue. And if you can't move from one place to the other, you really can't trade. And so we've been investing heavily in airports as well, like we did in the airport in Morocco, but also in Ghana and other places. Now, the issue for us, therefore, is to continue to invest a lot more in infrastructure. And as we look at that, the key is to make sure that the infrastructure are green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, quality infrastructure. That's very, very important. The second thing, of course, is being able to ensure that we can integrate the financial markets in Africa. The African Development Bank has been spending in financing quite a lot of this. For example, we have invested in helping to integrate the stock exchanges all the way from Johannesburg to Nairobi to Cairo to Lagos and so on. And all those stock exchanges actually account for $1.8 trillion in terms of money. And so you're talking about huge opportunities here to be able to list companies, to be able to therefore expand opportunities for investments in the region. The other area which the Deputy Prime Minister was talking about, which I want to touch on a little bit, is when he was talking about the digital revolution that he would say. That is going to be very important in terms of digital payments, trans-border payments all across the place. And I'm glad, Deputy Prime Minister, you mentioned the great work that Good, I think, is doing in this particular area for the single custom area in the East Africa community. But not only just them, in terms of digital payments, for example, you have a Singaporean company that is called Tunes, which is actually connecting PayPal to Safaricom to be able to make sure that any transactions you want to make from Safaricom on the M-Pesa platform, which is, we can talk about that later, you can make it directly to PayPal, which is very, very important. So basically, the digital investments have been significant from the bank. We have helped to connect, for example, to develop the East Africa submarine cable systems, which has driven down the cost of internet and integration, allowed integration in that area because of the lower cost of internet and broadband access. We've also done the same as well for Central Africa backbone, and we've invested heavily also in Trans-Sahara backbone, which is linking Niger, Mali, Chad, all the way to Algeria and Morocco and so on. So these are going to be very critical to allow for digital payments to take off significantly in the case of Africa. But one last thing that also I want to say is what we are doing in terms of getting access to trade finance, because trade finance is critical. We are investing heavily in trade finance. We support the Afri-Exim Bank. As you know, Afri-Exim Bank is doing a great job in terms of this area, working together with us. We support several banks on trade finance that have allowed us to do trade of almost $7 billion, and that will only continue. So let me just say that for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the key right now is finalizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Sustainable Investment Framework. And that will now make it easier for people to be able to look at a competition policy, to also be able to look at the intellectual property rights as you look at different types of digital investments that people are going to be making on the continent. But I'm really excited about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and I think that it provides an enormous opportunity for Singaporean companies. In fact, Deputy Prime Minister, even larger Singaporean companies that can come in there and take advantage of these vast economic opportunities offered by the area.
Thank you, Dr. Adesina. Lots of progress on the hard infrastructure side in Africa over the last 20, 25 years that I've been traveling, and you have eloquently described many of them. And by the way, we at Gateway are investors, as you know, in Liquid Intelligent Technologies, which is Africa's largest optic fiber and data center network, which enables a lot of this digital highway. But besides the hard infrastructure, I want to go to Senior Minister Tharman, because this is a topic I think very close to his heart. What do we need to do in terms of the soft infrastructure and the institutional infrastructure to harness Africa's potential?
Thanks, Shaka. I would say that two key priorities for the future are in public sector management, and second, in education. Education is, of course, a long-standing challenge everywhere in the developing world. I worry about the consequences of a very large proportion of the young population having lost a school year in Africa over the last year, and it's extremely important for them to get back into school, especially the girls. I think technology can be an aid in that regard, and I know there's some Singapore companies that are now in Africa trying to promote access to education through digital means, as well as to provide some of the lessons or content that we developed in Singapore, for instance, in coding and in science, into the curriculum in African schools. So that's going to be a big story, reducing the gaps in educational attainment between sub-Saharan Africa, especially, for that matter, I would say South Asia, which is in a very similar category, and the rest of the world. It's a huge priority. And if we don't make progress in education, there's ultimately going to be a limit to how much we can develop economically. There'll always be very bright entrepreneurial people, but the base of the population has to move up, and education is critical. Public sector management is an area where we've been very open to working with Africa. In fact, Dr. Adesina himself was keen to initiate this. The African Development Bank has a think tank, so to speak, that I wouldn't call it a think tank, really. It's a sort of a policy thinking outfit that we are keen to work with in Singapore, possibly using the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and our Civil Service College. It's one of the things that Singapore has put a lot of emphasis on, because we are a very small country without any resources, and therefore both human capital and public sector management have been critical assets for us. And whether it is sending teams of people to Singapore for some intense immersion and dialogue with partners in Singapore and partners from around the Asian region who gather in Singapore for these programs, or by selectively being able to work with African governments in their own public sector reform processes and agendas. There's certainly keenness on the part of several African governments to reform public sectors. It is a opportunity for cooperation between us and the African Development Bank and specific governments in Africa as we go forward.
In fact, that's absolutely correct, because when you think about innovation and digitalization in Africa, the examples which come readily to mind, world-class examples, are in the private sector. Whether it's M-Pesa or having something esoteric like rooftop solar powered by mobile phones and smart meters. Whereas Singapore, on the other hand, also has the private sector leading the way in innovation and digitalization, but the government has actually led the way in digitalizing, probably par excellence, better than most countries in the world. So probably there's a lot that Singapore can work with Africa and benefit Africa from that exchange. But Dr. Adesina, on the digitalization front, the pandemic, if anything, has accelerated digitalization. Our session today is a classic example of that. What role do you think digitalization will play in harnessing Africa's potential in an economic sense, in a political sense, in a social sense, in a broad sense? What are your thoughts, Tharman?
Well, first, let me just kind of divvy off from the point that the Deputy Prime Minister was making about the soft infrastructure, just to make the 3 points to add to what he said. He says that Singapore is a small country, we have no resources. In fact, when he came to see us at the African Development Bank, he said to me that in Singapore, the most important resource is human capital. And that, we have to focus a lot on human capital. And I think what Singapore has is tremendous amount of human capital. As you know, Deputy Prime Minister, I'm a great admirer of the development and the growth and development of Singapore, which I think offers tremendous amount of lessons for Africa. I've gone around talks, I talk about the experiences there. Small country, look at that started about the same in terms of GDP per capita as many African countries, and look at the GDP per capita today, almost 60,000 per head. But the 3 points I want to make is the importance of good governance. I think if there's any lesson that we can learn from Singapore, is this particular area. The second one, of course, is the issue of e-governance. And I think there are opportunities to work with Singaporean companies to support African countries as they drive for e-governance in many of their operations to get closer to citizens and all of that. And of course, the other part of that, which I think it's important, is the training the future generation for the digital world of today and tomorrow. And so, for example, the African Development Bank, we're investing in what's called Coding for Employment, in which we are working with Microsoft, with Google, and everybody at LinkedIn to train 234,000 Africans to be digitally smart for the digital world of tomorrow. So in that segue, back to your question, Shankar, I think when we look at the opportunities here for leapfrogging, in fact, I think I always say that, a frog cannot leap far, it can only jump so much. For Africa, we can't leapfrog. We need to be like a projectile that moves fast. And I think digital economy provides that opportunity. Digitalization, mobile telephony provides that opportunity. But as well as opportunities from fourth industrial revolution, whether it's in terms of artificial intelligence, whether it's in terms of robotics, whether in terms of automation, whether it's in terms of using robots, for example, in agriculture. The Deputy Prime Minister mentioned Africa's tremendous opportunities in agriculture. And by the way, you have Olam from Singapore that's doing tremendous work in Africa, in many, many, many countries. Opportunities to use the drones to sensors and helping in agriculture are enormous. But the one I want to talk about briefly is, and Shankar, you know this very well, because it's what has happened with the mobile telephone revolution in Africa. When you take a look at the banking systems in Africa, we have 300 million people that are unbanked, which is probably 17% of all the global unbanked population. But to improve that financial inclusion, you can't use brick and mortar banking system. And so Africa has actually become a projectile, not just even leapfrog, using mobile telephony. Today, you look at it, 80% mobile phone penetration is what you have in Africa. On internet penetration, it's about 36%. But in fact, the mobile phone, smartphones have actually opened up huge opportunities for more innovations here. In terms of, for example, digital phone, smartphones for Africa right now, it's about 36%. It's going to rise to about 65% in another 5 years. You know, and Mara, as you know, it's another great company manufacturing smartphones on the continent. But these new developments have allowed fintech companies to totally revolutionize digital payment systems. You know, how you pay money, how you receive remittances, and how you do savings, and how you do credit, and how you do insurance, and how you, all manner of things that you cannot do because of the revolution that this digitalization and mobile phone revolution affords for Africa. So you were talking about, Shankar, the case of M-Pesa. You know M-Pesa very, very well. Here you have Africa leading the world. M-Pesa started from Safaricom. And M-Pesa today, it's a digital payment system in which they process about 347 million transactions per month. And they processed, I think, about 2017, just about 60%, 50% of the whole GDP of Kenya passed through the M-Pesa digital platform. That should tell you how it is. And I think you've seen a lot of the big players notice these innovations and entrepreneurship the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned in Africa. For example, look at Visa. Visa and Stripe. Stripe went into Nigeria and invested $200 million in buying Paystack, right? And you look at Visa going into InterSwitch in Nigeria and actually taking a minority stake in that. InterSwitch, by the way, in Nigeria processes over 500 million transactions per month. To tell you how much digital payments, mobile money has actually done it. In Africa, therefore, today, 20% of Africa's population owns mobile accounts, and that is the largest in the world. Now, we were talking, Deputy Prime Minister was talking about the importance of the small players, small and medium-sized enterprises. In Africa today, Deputy Prime Minister, 80% of those small and medium-sized enterprises, or medium-sized enterprises, medium small enterprises, they own mobile accounts. It allows them to be able to do digital payments. So we are looking at a sector that is growing very, very fast. And the point I want to say to the Singaporean investors is pay attention to this particular space. Because you still have 300 million people that don't have access to banking accounts. You still have a situation in which this sector alone will probably be worth $300 billion in the next few years. And when you see the FDI going into this sector, it's been significant. In fact, as FDI has been reducing in other parts of Africa, not in this particular sector. Between 2019 and 2020, it went up from $1.1 billion to $1.3 billion. So pay attention to this particular space. And I think, Deputy Prime Minister, what I would just like to encourage you and your colleagues and the private sector in Singapore is you have well-trained engineers. You have experts in financial services. Take advantage of this digital revolution to support financial inclusion, digital payment systems, and all of this that are in Africa. And African Development Bank stands ready to work with you and your colleagues on that. I think this is an area in which Africa leads the rest of the world. And I think that we should even take some of these companies and make them even global companies.
Thank you for that, Dr. Adesina. In fact, if my memory serves me right, only 35% of the mobile phones today in Africa are still smartphones. So as that number increases, which inevitably it will, the digitalization trends will only further accelerate. I just want to move on to sustainability because that is front and center on everybody's mind. And before that, I just want to remind the audience to send in your questions. We will take as many as possible. Keep sending the questions. Now, supporting the transition to green growth is a key strategy of yours at the African Development Bank. Also, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, SM Tharman, which you chair, has really led the way globally in looking at this entire issue of decarbonization and catalyzing the green economy. Also, a lot of Singapore companies have done some very interesting stuff in the green space. The question for both of you, to you, Dr. Adesina, is what are the next steps really for Africa's sustainable development? What are some critical stuff which will happen, which is about to happen? And to you, Senior Minister Tharman, is really what role can Singapore companies play in sharing their green capabilities, including in areas like waste management and water, where we have done some very interesting stuff. So first to you, Dr. Adesina, and then to Senior Minister.
No, thank you very much. I think that one of the things that we need to pay attention to in growth is that when we measure growth just simply by GDP, we are doing the wrong thing because it doesn't really tell you the nature of that growth. And we cannot have growth that compromises the climate, compromises the environment. And therefore, we need to have sustainable development, climate resilient development. That is very, very key to every single thing that we do. It's not just simply increasing GDP that doesn't ask you what are the negative externalities or global externalities that you create from that GDP process. Now, when you take a look at Africa's development going forward, at the top of our work at the bank is to drive green growth and drive climate resilience. And why green growth? Okay, for example, if you take a look at the green economy, the blue economy, the economy in terms of recycling and all of that, whether it is for waste that you just mentioned, or whether it is in terms of garment and textiles, or also in terms of computers and how you deal with waste, it's $1 trillion market. And so really developing a green economy that's the economy of the future, is really going to be very, very key. The second one is to tackle climate change. For us at the African Development Bank, we can't have development in Africa when you have drought all over the place that is affecting farmers, when you have the situation with floods that is devastating populations and washing away infrastructure. So we must actually invest heavily in climate proofing Africa's developmental trajectory. For us at African Development Bank, we are doing that and doing that very well. You know, when I became president of the bank, when I was first elected in 2015, in 2016, we were developing about 9% of our total financing to climate. You know, right now we are 38% of our total financing devoted to climate, and we expect to reach, 40% by the end of this year, which is one of the largest you will find globally. But most important is that Africa needs to adapt to climate. We didn't cause it, but we are bearing the negative impact of it disproportionately compared to other parts of the world. And to adapt to that, the African Development Bank has increased significantly the proportion of our climate finance that goes actually to adaptation. You know, for example, today, we are actually putting about 63% of our climate finance into adaptation, which is the highest in the world, by the way. A report was just released by United Nations just about 2 weeks ago that says that African Development Bank leads all other global multilateral financial institutions in this particular area. Climate finance is important. 4 things that we are doing to continue to do this. First is we have just set up something with the Global Center for Adaptation under the chairmanship of the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, myself, and Patrick Vakujian, who is the president of the Global Center for Adaptation, called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. This is to mobilize $25 billion to support Africa in climate adaptation. In addition to that, we have also set up something called the Africa Financial Alliance for Climate, which is bringing together the stock exchanges, the central banks, the commercial banks, and the private sector to essentially find a way of decarbonizing Africa's growth trajectory. Green bonds, green financing, and all of that will have to be part of the way in which we get Africa to be to grow green and to be more climate resilient. The other area is what we are doing with regard to energy transitions, because Africa is leading the world in terms of potential for solar, for hydro, geothermal, but nobody can power anything using potential. You've got to turn potential into reality. And so we have set up something called the Desert to Power. And Desert to Power is going to be the world's largest solar zone in the Sahel of Africa that covers 11 countries. And that will provide electricity for 250 million people, roughly 10,000 megawatts. So the opportunities are immense here for Singapore and other countries that are in the solar technology to work with us in this particular area. And finally, and Tharman, the Deputy Prime Minister, given his global leadership in many of these areas, knows very well that we need to ensure that the rest of the world has access to financing to adapt to climate change. Since we started all the conversations, it says in Paris, we were there, we said we needed $100 billion a year for developed countries to support developing countries to be able to adapt to climate change and make these energy transitions. That money needs to be there because the promises that were made in Paris, which we all are going to have to adapt with, are conditional on having $100 billion to support climate resilience, to support climate adaptation, to support energy transitions. So I think a lot of work still needs to be done as we all look at COP26 in Glasgow to make sure that those resources are promised for developing countries, in particular African countries in my case, are there to support countries to implement their nationally determined contributions going forward. But the future is green, and we are there to support greening of Africa's economic trajectory.
And to you, Senior Minister Tharman, the question about Singapore and its green credentials and how it can help Africa.
Well, I think Dr. Adesina has painted a very powerful vision, and Africa is already on its way. We will all have to change everything we do, the way we live. It has to be a whole of society effort. I think we should think of this holistically. It is first and foremost about carbon emissions and how we decarbonize, how we make that transition to clean energy. It is about adaptation, as Dr. Adesina was emphasizing. And it is also more broadly about the circular economy and biodiversity. They're all interconnected. Singapore has capabilities in the circular economy, specifically in waste and water management. That's something which we had, by force of circumstance, to put a lot of investment into, and innovations have come out of it. And that's an area where we could very usefully participate in Africa's next phase of transition. Second, I would say there's a whole range of innovations that's going to be necessary. The more innovation we have, the less the carbon price, the carbon tax will have to increase. I mean, we're going to, one way or another, carbon taxes are going to have to go up globally. But the more innovation we have to reduce the cost of alternative energy and to make available new products and services which are energy efficient, the more that type of innovation, the less we'll have to resort to, the less we will need a very high carbon tax all over the world. And innovations are necessary in every sphere of the economy and society. An area which Singapore is putting a lot of emphasis into, for instance, has to do with building materials, construction methods, and urban design, because we're a city. Construction materials are ripe for innovation. because cement and concrete is a significant contributor to carbon emissions. We have companies which are now very engaged in developing low carbon concrete products. Some of them are already in Africa, like Pan United Corporation. Urban design is extremely important when you think of the whole ecosystem of carbon emissions. How much travel and transport is required from one place to another, how convenient it is for people. It's both about the quality of life, but also one way or another, it's to do with how much energy we use in our daily lives, getting to and fro work, as well as the whole system of powering our neighborhoods. So that's another area which Singapore could get quite involved in. I would just say that on the financial side, we're going to be launching at the end of this year the Climate Impact, what's called Climate Impact X or CIX, which is really a carbon trading platform. There are carbon trading platforms and the carbon trading platforms, and what's lacking today is high quality, high credibility carbon markets. And we are starting one in Singapore. DBS, StanChart, Temasek, and the Singapore Exchange are collaborating on this. And as it takes off, we would want to link up with Africa, because it's a bit like FTAs. You start off in your own region, but you eventually want to tie them up. And carbon exchanges will ultimately need scale to allow for diversification and to attract the large investors. So it's not the solution to our problems, but it is part of the solution. Having efficient carbon trading platforms is part of the solution, and we intend to be a leader in that field.
And also, isn't that very important, Senior Minister, because there is a trade-off between sustainability and growth, and some of the sustainable strategies are more expensive than not so sustainable strategies. So innovation is the way to address that cost curve. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree entirely with that. That's the right way of thinking about it.
I just want to move on to the next subject. I know we are getting to the end of what has been a fascinating session. I want to explore something for the audience in terms of which they would be absolutely interested to hear from you, is the sectors with the most potential. So if I'm not already invested in Africa, or I don't know Africa well, from the vantage point from where you sit, Dr. Adesina, and SM Tharman, you also made a trip to Africa not that long ago and came away with some very good feedback. So I would like to hear from you as to if I'm looking to invest in Africa, what should I be looking at? Would you like to go actually? Okay, Dr. Adesina, please go first.
Oh, no, please go ahead. You want to answer?
I really enjoy listening to Dr. Adesina, so please.
I enjoy listening to you too, so you go first.
Okay, well, there's so much to talk about. I would say, think about the huge opportunity in SMEs, how we link up SMEs, how we create platforms for SMEs to be exporting to a different part of the world, platforms where they can get credit, including small credit, how we reduce risk perceptions that are due to lack of information about SMEs. And to give two examples of the initiatives we've embarked on, one is basically a hub of networks. We know of all the large mega platforms that exist around the world, but actually for SMEs around the world, there's no easy way today in which they can get connected with SMEs in a different part of the world as buyers or sellers or to obtain credit. And we've started what we call Proxterra, which is to link up platforms. We already have some Kenyan and Ghanaian platforms that are linking up with Proxterra, and it will allow the SMEs in their domestic environments to be able to link up with other regions of the world. And it's always fascinating about how SMEs who start off in a very local environment can find buyers very far away from where they are. Credit is important. And we have started another initiative between regulators, Singapore and Ghana, the Bank of Ghana and the Ghanaian government. It's something which we launched or we initiated on my last visit, are now providing, we've embarked on a live pilot. We call it the Financial Trust Corridor, where there's a digital exchange of information on SMEs so that banks and others can have confidence very easily in small customers in Africa and be able to provide credit. Plus, customers will also have confidence in them. And even from the point of view of other regulatory concerns, whether it's anti-money laundering or other concerns, we've got a free exchange of information. And this digital corridor aims to provide that. So it's one of the examples of what we have to do. Company to company, banks to banks, platforms to platforms, but also government and central banks with each other.
Dr. Adesina, besides, of course, agriculture, which is your favorite subject, what are the other opportunities?
Yeah, of course. Let me say that I think energy, what challenges that Africa faces are actually the opportunities, because the deficit we have in energy is still significant. So I see a tremendous amount of opportunities for investing in energy, renewable energy, in particular when you go into mini grids and microgrids, and also looking into how you get into solar. I mean, solar area, it's a big, vast opportunities for companies to invest in. I think infrastructure, I would say, and logistics are very, very important areas. And I'm glad that the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned the leadership of Singapore in these areas. And I think Africa can use a lot of investment in that, especially as we link it to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. When you look at agriculture, and the Deputy Prime Minister said it earlier on, which is Africa has 65% of the uncultivated arable land left to feed 9 billion people in the world. And so what we do with Africa's agriculture is going to determine the future of food in the world. And in agriculture, there are vast opportunities for that, for value-added processing of agricultural products. Africa exports a lot of primary commodities, but look, that's not the future. The future is in processing and adding value and integrating into global value chain. So we at the African Development Bank are now working with several partners to develop what's called the special agro-industrial processing zones across many areas of Africa. And these are going to be areas that are going to be enabled with critical infrastructure to allow food processing companies to be located there. So whether you're processing cocoa or coffee or cashew or any commodities, you have the infrastructure to develop the right value chains to be competitive in that. And I think this is an area that opportunities are. In fact, there's a company linked to Holland that's called Organised that is already doing some of this in Gabon, and we hope that we can work with them as part of the Temasek to see how we can be able to extend this, Deputy Prime Minister, into various parts of Africa. The digital economy, as I mentioned, it's vast. I think digital payments, financial services is going to be a vast area for Singapore to look into. And of course, I fully agree with the Deputy Prime Minister on the issue of small and medium-sized enterprises and how to connect that. Manufacturing will become very, very key for Africa. We talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, but that area is not just going to be a consumption zone. It has to be a manufacturing zone. So investing in manufacturing, helping Africa in manufacturing is going to be an area that I think is very important. And you can see the trend already. In the past, when people were investing in Africa, they were investing in oil and gas and metals and minerals. But today, when you look at the diversification of FDI going to Africa, it's going more into services, more into manufacturing, go into energy and renewable energy and all these things. So that trend is the right trend. And I think that's something for Singaporean firms to take note of and to take advantage of.
And also, would you agree, Dr. Adesina, that with the African Free Trade Agreement, you actually have an integrated market which allows you to get economies of scale or the benefits of aggregation and create centers of excellence around certain products, which is probably not available before.
Oh, absolutely, yes. In fact, you raise a good point there, because if you look at what, if I were to give advice to Singaporean firms, this is what I would say is take advantage of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to be able to pool resources, to be able to have markets across several countries. It's important for them to be able to do that. But also African Development Bank, we're investing in a number of large companies, right? So we shouldn't forget that Asia, Latin America also developed by having large firms. So we're doing what we call the Africa Champions. So 100 companies that we want them to become global companies. And these, for example, could be in manufacturing, they could be in automation, they could be in digital financial services, or I know the Deputy Prime Minister was talking about cement, but I think for a while we're still going to have to do some cement. So I think Dangotes and all the others that are doing cement have opportunities. So, but how to connect those with Singaporean firms so that they can take advantage of, as big firms, taking advantage of Singaporeans' expertise.
In fact, you mentioned Dangote Cement, and that's a classic case of a homegrown success, which has become one of the top 10 global producers of cement, and effectively taken away the need to import cement in many markets, including Nigeria. So import substitution as a strategy has also worked, and there is a potential for that in Africa and space.
Absolutely.
I just want to, there's a question from the audience, and there is a lot of it which relates to the pace of reforms being slow. And this is really to you, Dr. Adesina, that everybody agrees that the opportunity is huge, but the pace of reforms is still very slow. Any sense of what, is it improving? Will it improve?
Well, I think that, reforms is a process, and it takes learning. But the fact is the pace of reform is actually in the right direction with regard to Africa. If you look in many places in Africa today, it's a lot easier to set up businesses faster. You can set up businesses faster. I think a good strength of Singapore, which many African countries are also doing, is the security of property rights and rule of law in many of the places, and making sure that the sanctity of financial transactions are respected. And we are seeing that, for example, in the way in which we do the Africa Investment Forum. I mean, the Africa Investment Forum is where we bring in investors from all over the world, okay, together into boardroom conversations with government officials, senior presidents, prime ministers, and so on. And they basically say, well, look, we're going to invest all this in your country, provided that these kind of regulatory reforms are in place. If you're doing energy, for example, that there be a cost-reflective tariff so that you can actually invest in the energy sector. And we've had huge success, as you know, Chanka, and also Deputy Prime Minister, with the Africa Investment Forum, because that has been able, we started in 2018. The first one we did, we had $38.7 billion of investment interest secured in less than 72 hours. We did it in 2019, we had $40.1 billion of investment interest in less than 72 hours. And we're going to have the one for this year from 17 to 19 of November, virtual, just like this, in a hybrid mode, which I think others should participate in. These boardroom sessions allows investors to push government to make sure they put in place the right policies and incentives for them to actually make the investments and to be able to take their monies out in terms of when they have actually finished their investments there. I think this is something that's very important, but I agree there are still some challenges that Africa has to fix. For example, the whole issue of corruption in a number of areas has to go down. The issue of illicit capital flows needs to go down. And my friend, Tharman, is working in terms of global financial transparency in many of these tax issues for Africa and the rest of the world. But that said, I think that everybody realizes that in Africa, it is not the governments that are going to grow the economy. It's the private sector that's going to grow the economy. The government has to provide the enabling environment for that. And so for us as the African Development Bank, We are working with government, both in terms of our financing, to make sure that there are reforms as part of the financing that we give. If we give a policy-based operation, we ask for reforms, macroeconomic reforms, financial management reforms, and also in terms of dealing with corruption and sanctity of property rights. These are things that we do normally inside of our work. But I think that you will see that a lot of things have improved in Africa with regard to that, even though there are still some ways to go in some countries.
Thank you for that. We are coming to the close of this, and we got literally 2 minutes left. So I just want to give the floor back to both of you. If you had one closing comment, a minute each, for the audience, and what's been a very fascinating discussion. What do you want them to take away from this discussion? I would like to go to you, Dr. Adesina, first, and then close it with Senior Minister Tharman.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Shankar. I'll just say two things. First is, Singapore is a friend of Africa. Singapore clearly believes in Africa. It's demonstrated, which has so many companies in Africa. All I want to say is Singaporean companies should do what the Deputy Prime Minister said. Take advantage of the open platform that Africa, welcoming platform that Africa has. Grow your businesses, expand the businesses, be co-creators for Africa's transformation. It's very, very important. We learn all about your success stories. The Deputy Prime Minister was talking about the Lincoln Institute of Public Policy that we want to do a lot of work with. But at the end of the day, it's working together and financing, investing in Africa that really matters. And the second thing I want to say is that the African Development Bank is there to be with you. We can support you in terms of preparing projects, in terms of co-financing projects, in terms of de-risking projects that you want to bring to Africa, because that's what we are there. This year, the African Development Bank was rated as the best multilateral finance institution in the world. And that is to give you confidence that we are partners that you can rely on. And on that closing note, I would like to encourage my dear friend, the Deputy Prime Minister. I love your country, and you and I have talked about the fact that I think that you should be co-creators with us. I would like you to join the African Development Bank. This is Africa's only AAA rated financial institution. Our capital went up from $93 billion to $208 billion recently. And I think that the experience today shows that Singapore and Africa are working very closely together. I know there are issues that you will have to discuss and how you are going to look into those, but I will be very delighted to carry this conversation to across Africa, to have Singapore actually being a member of the African Development Bank. And with that, let me just say that I look forward, Deputy Prime Minister, to being able to visit with you. I love Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The closing words are yours, Senior Minister Tharman. Over to you. I think you're on mute, Senior Minister.
Sorry, once again, it's just so inspiring to listen to Dr. Adesina. I think he sums things up extremely well. There's opportunity. Singapore companies should focus on what they're good at and try to do it well. If we do what we do well, Africa's a huge field for us. Find the right partners, get a foothold, and start growing. If you like, Africa being a major horticultural exporter, Africa is like a rosebud. It's opening, and it's going to be a beautiful rose. It's going to be a beautiful rose in the years to come.
On that floral note, let's end. It's been a pleasure to moderate both of you. We promised at the beginning that we had two great thought leaders, and this discussion has just proved that. Thank you all, and thank you to Enterprise Singapore for hosting this forum. It's been a pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tharman. Goodbye.
See you soon.
Thank you, Chairman Ong. Bye.